This is the first of two lectures on Thomas Friedman's From Beirut to Jerusalem. Now, I've entitled this first presentation as Friedman in Beirut. However, it will also deal with aspects of his position on the conflict between the Israelis and the Palestinians, since they are, in the way in which he presents this material, they're inextricably interrelated. And this is in part linked to his uh, view of himself as an American Jew who is living in Beirut first and then in Jerusalem and writing about that conflict. But although he is a New York Times reporter, he's a very well-known New York Times reporter and writer of op-eds for many years now, but he's at this time writing, trying to be an objective journalist, but at the same time very much aware that he's implicated in the conflicts in the region by virtue of his particular identity as a Jewish man and as a Jewish American man. And this is something we'll want to explore as we look at the way in which Thomas Friedman depicts these questions. Now, the goal of this presentation, of both of the presentations, because this is followed by part two, which is Friedman in Jerusalem, is not to take any particular side in this conflict necessarily, but rather to look at the issues in as objective fashion as possible, although aware, of course, that complete objectivity is something of an illusion. I, too, have my own perspective on these conflicts as well. But we're trying to, in the first instance, merely understand the questions for what they are and for in other words, to develop an understanding first before we criticize, on the assumption that any criticism that one might have of Friedman's views or, say, Edward Said's views or anybody who weighs in on this conflict will be a much more convincing, from a rhetorical perspective if it's an informed one, if it's based in understanding rather than in prejudice. And that's what we're seeking to do, is to develop a complex understanding of these conflicts. Now, having said that, we're not going to give Friedman or anybody a free pass. We'll have to ask hard questions when they're merited as we're going through some of this material. Now, I'll try to keep this presentation as brief as possible. The first of these two presentations will deal with issues in terms of literary genre as we explore this material. This is, in the first instance, this is a work, this is a non-fictional narrative written in English, and the context is that we're looking at this in an English department at Western Washington University, and we're analyzing this text based in questions of literature, literary analysis, literary theory, literary criticism. That's why we're performing a close reading, and that, in some sense, is going to be more important to us, or at least primary to our considerations. Let's say the intrinsic, to use an American New Critical distinction, we're going to look at the intrinsic questions before we examine the extrinsic questions, which is to say, we're going to examine those questions that arise from a close analysis of the text itself before we weigh in or consider extrinsic, historical, political, or questions that are external to the text. So we're just trying to understand what the text says, what for its own merits, and trying not to be too prejudicial in our examination of it. Although I do affirm the Gadamerean idea that it's, of course, impossible finally to understand any text without bringing to it our own prejudices. And in the Gadamerean sense, the term prejudice was unfairly discredited in the Enlightenment. There is such a thing as a bad form of prejudice, which is coming to a hasty conclusion. Instead, we're not talking about that kind of prejudice. That's always a bad form of prejudice, but the idea of prejudging, using our faculties of prejudging, which is the only way that we really have of understanding a literary text. This is the argument of Hans-Jörg Gadamer, and this is one that I'll affirm here as we're going through this material. Now, here's a picture of Thomas Friedman. He was born in 1953. The text we're looking at is From Beirut to Jerusalem. Now, Friedman wrote a number of texts throughout his life. He's written a number of works. He's also written a number of op-eds. I won't mention them here. I find that this text is his most significant one. Some of the others are more popularizing views, but he has been an anchor, a person in American political life. He's weighed in over the years on questions ranging from Israel, Palestine, Syria, Lebanon, to China, and in American politics as well. And so he's a very prominent figure and one certainly worth investigating. Now, he is, as I said, an American Jewish man. He was born in Minnesota, and he tells us very frankly in the opening pages of From Beirut to Jerusalem that his interest in Jerusalem and coming to this region really springs from his own experiences as a Jewish American boy growing up in Minneapolis who became very interested in Israel at a very young age. And it's out of this interest grew over the years and led him to serving as a correspondent for the New York Times, first in Beirut and then in Jerusalem. And he, after that experience where he reported, he wrote about it in this rather lengthy non-fictional narrative, which has the character of a coming of age story. So it's a autobiographical account, and but if we think of it in terms of literary genre, it's akin to a Bildungsroman, to put it in the German terms. It's which is a novel of social formation. This is, of course, a non-fictional narrative, but it's like a non-fictional novel of social formation. So while on the one hand, this is a narrative about the political and historical events that are taking place in Beirut and Jerusalem, particularly in the 1980s. It's also a narrative of social formation, of Thomas Friedman himself coming to maturation. And so this is one of the reasons why I think it has a particular literary quality that I myself find lacking in some of his other works. But it gives it a very interesting flavor. And this is one of the things that we want to think about as we're examining these issues is who is Thomas Friedman? Now, we can think of that historically as Thomas Friedman, the New York Times op-ed writer, but I'm asking this question more in terms of the I, the narrative I that is constructed in the text. Who is this I, or what is this I who speaks? Because there's a sense in which the narrative I, the self, the ego that Friedman constructs in the pages of this text is by no means a natural entity, but is in fact a narrative construction. And this is one of the things we want to think about as we examine some of the passages from this text. Now, an early question we need to ask from the very beginning of this narrative, Thomas Friedman cites a passage from Mark Twain's Huckleberry Finn, which is one of the most important novels in the American literary tradition. As Ernest Hemingway, who said, all of American literature really comes out of Huckleberry Finn. That might be an exaggeration. Hemingway didn't mention, for instance, Walt Whitman. Perhaps he should have, but he meant by that, I think, what is similar to Twain and Whitman is that both of them affirmed American vernacular English. And so these were distinctly American writers. And while Thomas Friedman is, of course, a Jewish American, he is an American. He's writing as an American writer, and he is positioning himself in a particular tradition. So it's not insignificant that he cites Huckleberry Finn. And I want to think about this also in larger terms. One question that you should ask yourself is, historically, is if we look at the way that Palestinians like, say, Edward Said have written, and Said was a Palestinian American, whereas Said is a Palestinian American, whereas Friedman is a Jewish American. They're both writing on the same conflict, but they're going to see it in very different terms. Now, the Palestinian American and Palestinians in general, like Edward Said, are going to tend to see the conflict in terms of it being an instance of settler colonialism, European or Ashkenazi Zionists coming to Palestine and settling the lands much along the model of, let's say, American settlers coming to the Old West, or European Dutch people coming to South Africa and trying to colonize and settle the lands that essentially don't belong to them. or is it a matter of an ancient tribal feud? Now, Friedman, as an American Jewish man, is not going to, as we're going to see, he's not going to think of this conflict along the lines of it being an instance of settler colonialism in the way that someone like Edward Said does or will, but rather a tribal feud. And so he's going to quote at the very beginning an interesting citation from Mark Twain's Huckleberry Finn about of a kind of a feud between the Grangerfords and the Shepherdsons, and this is an analogy that he's going to develop. It's akin to the idea. Twain is perhaps riffing on the feuds like the famous Hatfield and McCoy feud, and so the question that I think we need to ask ourselves is: does this analogy of a kind of a hillbilly feud in the hills of the Appalachians, for instance, or in West Virginia, does this really hold up in the context, say, of Lebanon? Does it hold up in the context of the Palestinian-Israeli state? Or is this a misguided analogy? And so what are some of the implications of this analogy as well? Now, also, it's important to note, of course, Twain is such a key figure for American writers, and so he's a kind of a father of American literature, and so Friedman is most certainly positioning himself in a very particular way as he composes this quite literary, non-fictional narrative. Now, before we look at Friedman's view, I just want to remind those listening to this of our definition of settler colonialism. I introduced this in another lecture on this website on Theodore Herzl's The Jewish State. And so here's the definition. So if you say, well, I don't want to just assume that you know what settler colonialism is, and if you've listened to the lecture on Herzl, it's worth reviewing for just a moment so that we can see essentially what Friedman is not saying. So this would be more akin to what the Palestinian, what Said's view would be on this conflict. Settler colonialism is a form of colonialism that seeks to replace the original population of the colonized territory with a new society of settlers. Settler colonialism is enacted by a variety of means ranging from violent depopulation of the previous inhabitants to more subtle legal means such as assimilation or recognition of indigenous identity within a colonial framework. Unlike other forms of colonialism, the imperial power does not always represent the same nationality as the settlers. However, the colonizing authority generally views the settlers as racially superior to the previous inhabitants, which may give settlers' social movements and political demands greater legitimacy than those of colonized peoples in the eyes of the home colonies, whereas natural and human resources are the main motivation behind other forms of colonialism. Okay, so this is most certainly not what Thomas Friedman is saying. Now, I'm as I said, I have my own sort of prejudice as well. I'm a member of the Muskogee Creek Nation, and as a member of a nation that has experienced many decades of settler colonialism, it's quite hard for me to be affirmative about settler colonialism. But I mentioned that in passing because if you're Palestinian, like let's say, for instance, from Yasser Arafat's perspective, what Arafat always argued that the situation of the Palestinians was more akin to Indians in the United States or Native Americans, rather than, say, it being akin to the situation of African Americans or Black peoples in the United States, because they experienced Native Americans, the Muskogee, for instance, experienced settler colonialism. They were ethnically depopulated. They were forcibly moved from, say, Georgia to the state of Oklahoma, and the so-called Trail of Tears, and then even then, their land after the Dawes Act was underwent many more decades of settler colonialism as white settlers tried to take the land from Native Americans. And so this is not what what Friedman is saying. It would be more akin to what, say, someone like Yasser Arafat and Edward Said would be saying about this conflict. But this is the view that is not Friedman's. I just want to be clear about that. So the view that Friedman is going to advocate is more akin to this idea of a kind of a Hatfield and McCoy feud. This tribal feud, famous film has been made about this with Kevin Costner and Bill Paxton, the Hatfield and McCoys. This is a legendary feud in American history between two different, families that killed each other. And then after a significant amount of time went, they just sort of forgot what they were killing each other even for. And so this is what Twain is sort of playing on. Let's see how he describes this. He says, this is the quote that Friedman sets in the beginning passages of From Beirut to Jerusalem from Huckleberry Finn. Did you want to kill him, Buck? Well, I bet I did. What did he do to you? Him? He never done nothing to me. Well, then what did you want to kill him for? Why, nothing. Only it's on account of the feud. What's a feud? Why, where was you raised? Don't you know what a feud is? Never heard of it before. Tell me about it. Well, says Buck, a feud is this way. A man has a quarrel with another man and kills him. Then that other man's brother kills him. Then the other brothers on both sides go for one another. Then the cousins chip in, and by everybody's killed off and there ain't no more feud. But it's kind of slow, and it takes a long time. Has this one been going on a long time, Buck? Well, I should reckon it started 30 years ago or somewheres along there. There was trouble about something, and then a lawsuit to settle it, and the suit went again one of the men, and so he up and shot the man that won the suit, which he would naturally do, of course. Anybody would. Well, what was the trouble about, Buck? Land? I reckon maybe, I don't know. Well, who done the shooting? Was it a Granger, Ford, or a Shepherdson? Laws, how do I know? It was so long ago. Well, don't anybody know? Oh, yes, Pa knows, I reckon, and some of the other old people, but they don't know now what the row was all about in the first place. All right, well, there's the view of what Friedman's going to want to cast this as is not an instance of settler colonialism, but a tribal feud in which two different tribal groups, two different families, ethnic groups, families, if you want to put it in those terms, have been killing one another for so many years that they don't even know anymore. They've forgotten altogether what they were killing one another about. Now, let's say if you're a Palestinian reader of this text, the first thing you're going to say is, well, wait a minute. We know quite well what we're fighting about. We're fighting because we got deposed of our land. We got pushed off of our land during the Nakba, or the catastrophe when Israel was formed in 1948. We lost our homes. Many people were killed. We got pushed into Jordan, Lebanon, Syria, and we're still waiting to get back to our original homeland. And we're now a people that don't even have a nation anymore or a homeland anymore. And so we know quite well what this fight is about. And so this can be, I mentioned this as a critical question to consider, because this can be quite misleading. Because again, Friedman is writing for an American audience, and he's appealing, he's framing this conflict in a particular way, and we're going to see this framework is something he's going to develop throughout the narrative, and so that it's not certainly not an instance of objective journalism, but it promotes a particular perspective. Now, again, I'm not myself wanting to necessarily criticize that perspective here. We're just trying to understand it, but I want to make really clear that the narrative is far from objective. There is a thesis to this narrative. There is something that Friedman is trying to persuade us of, and it starts from the very first quotation from Twain before we even read a word of Friedman's own narrative. Okay, so one question that we have to ask ourselves, then an important question, is who is this book written for? Who is Friedman's main constituency or audience? And an easy answer to this question, well, it's written for Americans. It's written for Americans like you and I, those who are taking my class at Western Washington University, who are reading this text, who don't really understand this conflict, and they want to understand it. And so he's going to lay it out for us in a clear way. So by the time we get to this end of this narrative, we'll have a very clear sense of what the conflict is about. Now, this is a biased account. But it is, I think one of the things you have to give Friedman a lot of credit for is he's a very gifted writer, and he does a very good job of, as an American, of taking this quite complex conflict and presenting it in terms that make it accessible to an American audience. And so it is a very persuasive text. But we're here. We don't want to take for granted some of the rhetorical strategies that Friedman adopts. We're calling them into question here. So one thing I would encourage you to do as you respond to this question of who was Friedman's audience is to explore the imagery that he adopts throughout the narrative, particularly imagery from the American Wild West when he describes his experience of Beirut as being like in the Old West, where you're having shootouts in the streets, a lawless land. He's also going to evoke Thomas Hobbes' state of nature, a place that is essentially an anarchistic, lawless region, where shootouts at the OK Corral, where those kinds of incidents happen on a daily basis. Again, this promotes a particular point of view, but it does so with reference to the American imagination, so that Americans can immediately identify with what he's saying. Because, for instance, I myself, growing up in Oklahoma, saw a lot of John Wayne films and films of the American West. We can think of Kevin Costner's Wyatt Earp, so on, that really he relies upon an iconography that is very familiar to the American imagination in telling the story. I'm going to quote that I evoked previously when in my lecture on Theodor Herzl on the Jewish state, this notion that was promoted early in the early days of the Zionist movement, that Palestine is a country without a people and the Jews are a people without a country. Or as Chaim Weizmann, the president of the World Zionist Congress, said in 1914, in its initial stage, Zionism was conceived by its pioneers as a movement wholly depending on mechanical factors. There is a country which happens to be called Palestine, a country without a people, and on the other hand, there exists the Jewish people, and it has no country. What else is necessary then to fit the gem into the ring to unite this people with this country? Okay, so we might note here the language of pioneers. The Jews who come to Israel or Palestine area are akin to pioneers. Now, American settlers who came from Europe, came to the Old West, were also pioneers, and in the mythical language vocabulary of the Old West, they come to an empty land that just has a few Indians here and there hiding out in the bushes, but essentially it's a depopulated, empty land. Now this is going to be a common refrain in the history of the literature of the Zionist movement, but it's one that I mention here because it's one that Palestinians are always going to contest. They're going to want to insist that there was a people already there, and they're going to find this problematic. And so this is something we need to think about when we look at Friedman, evoking the language of the Old West in his description of this conflict. Now, here's a very famous painting of Manifest Destiny, that all of this land in the West belonged to Americans. You can see there's a allegorical image of this idea of manifest destiny, the pioneers coming across the prairie, the Native Americans, the savages being chased out as this essentially empty land with buffalo and a few savages is being cultivated by this movement from the east towards the west. And so you might want to think about that, because there is an entire history of this kind of imagery and iconography that is very powerful in the American imagination. And we might want to think about how the Zionist movement in general, but Friedman in particular, draws upon this iconography in his depiction of these conflicts. Now, he's going to say, quite frankly, during his time in Beirut, he's going to evoke a description of Lebanon as being akin to Hobbes's state of nature, which would be a state that exists, an anarchistic state that exists prior to the formation of the first social contract, which Hobbes, would have abhorred, living in this lawless, barbaric state of nature. He says, here's Friedman, Thomas Hobbes describes what he called the state of nature that would exist if government and society completely broke down and the law of the jungle reigned. In such a condition, Hobbes wrote, where every man is enemy to every means, there is no place for industry, because the fruit therein is uncertain, and consequently no culture of earth. I don't know if Beirut is a perfect Hobbesian state of nature, but it is probably the closest thing to it that exists in the world today. Now, Friedman is describing his experiences in Lebanon, and when you read his text, there's some very powerful descriptions that he has of the anarchy chaos that he experienced as this civil war broke out in Lebanon, in which so many people were killed in what seemed to be completely senseless deaths. But I think and so I think it's he's pulling on conceptual resources that are available to him to describe what was arguably a terrible state of anarchy that he lived through. And I don't want to diminish that experience that he had, because I'm sure it was quite frightening, and many Lebanese lived through very terrible events at that time. But I think we also have to also ask ourselves, is it fair to describe one of the most ancient centers of human civilization and culture as a lawless state of nature? When we think of, for instance, Syria and Lebanon and their very ancient histories, there's this is arguably the cradle of civilization itself, second perhaps only to Egypt in terms of the Levant anyway, or the Mediterranean region. And so, but for Friedman, this ancient culture is completely superseded by this state of anarchy, this Hobbesian state of lawlessness that prevails. This, in any case, is these are the concepts and images that he's going to evoke in describing his experiences in Beirut. Now, we also, I think, have to ask ourselves. Mark Twain reappears at other places in this text, besides in this inset from Huckleberry Finn. He also is going to evoke Mark Twain's Innocents Abroad. Now, for those of you unfamiliar with this text, this is a text not as well known as Twain's Huckleberry Finn, but it's an interesting non-fictional narrative, and I think in some ways it also provides maybe even a more relevant literary or generic model for Friedman than does Huckleberry Finn, because this is a story. Twain took a trip from America to Jerusalem. He went to the Holy Land, and he writes about his experience as an American traveling in the Holy Land. And so Friedman is, he sees Mark Twain quite clearly as somebody who precedes him. And in this regard, even the title of Twain's book is quite revealing, because Twain describes the Americans who come to Palestine, who come to see the Holy Land in the late 19th century, as being innocents who are looking at things they just don't really understand. And this also is how Friedman is going to describe himself as a young man in Beirut, as a young man in Jerusalem. As I said previously, it's a coming of age. So it's on the one hand a travel narrative like Twain's Innocents Abroad, but on the other hand, it's a Bildungsroman, or a coming of age story, a story about the loss of innocence. Now, we could think of it as, in an allegorical sense. We can think of it as the story of Friedman himself as a young Jewish American man coming to Beirut for the first time, how he himself loses his innocence in some sense. And so by the end of this rather long book, we could think of him as a sort of a sadder but wiser man, someone who's learned, who has shed his naivete and has become more mature through his experiences that he undergoes in both Beirut and Jerusalem. And similarly, this is this experience that Mark Twain goes through when he has quite high, grandiose notions about what he's going to find, say, when he looks at the Jordan River in Palestine, and how he becomes disappointed by what he sees. So it's sort of high expectations, and then how those expectations are dashed when he experiences the reality of how, let's say, even squalid and small Palestine is compared to this grandiose notion that he built up in his own imagination. But Friedman is going to use the same kind of notion of him being an innocent abroad as also, and I think this is what's most important for us as readers of this text, as a kind of an allegory for American involvement in the Middle East, to implying in effect that Americans, like the Marines who were stationed in Beirut, where many of them were killed into the Reagan era in the suicide bombing at their barracks. They themselves came in quite naive, but they left not as naive and optimistic as they were when they arrived. So we might want to think of that as well. Now here you can see an image of Mark Twain from there's his book Innocents Abroad. I do recommend it. It's a fun read. And there's an illustration on the far right from Twain's book of being in the land. You can see the camel in the background, being in Palestine and the things that he experiences. And there on the far left is Mark Twain at Village Books here in Bellingham, Washington, because Twain famously also came to Bellingham for a time and gave a talk in Fairhaven. I believe this was prior to his embarking on his adventure in the Holy Lands. Now, here's what Twain says in Innocents Abroad, and this is something that Friedman himself is going to quote directly in the text of From Beirut to Jerusalem. Here's Twain. He says, "Travel and experience mar the greatest pictures and rob us of the most cherished traditions of our boyhood. Well, let them go. I have already seen the empire of King Solomon diminished to the size of Pennsylvania. I suppose I can bear the reductions of the seas of Galilee and the Dead Sea and the River Jordan." So he expects one thing and he gets something quite smaller than what he expected. So he's commenting on how he built up this really grandiose idea of what he was going to experience and how small it was after he did in fact see it. And here's what Friedman says. This is, as he's coming really closer towards the end of the narrative, as he's reflecting on his long experiences in both Beirut and Jerusalem before going back to America, a changed person. He says, as I reflect on what I've learned along this road from Beirut to Jerusalem, I find myself drawn to a chapter in Mark Twain's The Innocents Abroad, in which he describes the moment during his travels through the Middle East when he first beheld the River Jordan. Like Twain, the Middle East had first entered my consciousness in the wake of the Six-Day War as a grand tapestry. But the longer I stayed there, the more it seemed to become something very small. So, okay, that's a very revealing passage as we think of this as, again, a kind of a novel of maturation, a novel of social formation. But what we have to ask ourselves, I think, too, is the question, as I mentioned earlier, of the I or the ego, the self that Friedman is going to construct in the pages of this text. And so one question I would encourage you to consider is, to what extent is Friedman an allegorical figure of the ordinary and innocent, quote, and I put innocent in quotes there, Americans abroad. Now, this is something to really think about, because when you think about the sort of the shenanigans of U.S. foreign policy in the last, let's say particularly since the Kissinger period in the early 1970s, the United States has a very checkered history of involvement in the region. And so to depict the American involvement as something that is essentially innocent, there's a thesis there. That would be my main point, is that there's certainly a thesis there. And so when we think of this as a coming of age narrative, or we think of the I that develops, that Friedman develops, that let's say the character development that this I undergoes from this very naive young boy that Friedman describes in the beginning passages of this narrative to this older and wiser man at the end, we have to remember that this I is not necessarily an I, but a we. All right. Now, I say allegory, and I don't want to simply assume that everybody knows what I mean. But if you look to the far left, you can see this is a medieval morality play called Every Man, and you'd have a particular individual character, and he would be an individual character, but he wasn't just an individual character. Every man was a representation of all of us, of every man, in effect. And there on the far right, you see Dante, the author of the Divine Comedy, and in the middle, you see an image of the Inferno. And so, if we think of when Dante goes into the bowels of hell, where he travels through these circuits, Dante too tells us very frankly in his letter to Congrandus Scalia that his famous poem is meant to be read allegorically. Now, what that means is that he is himself a figure of all people as they journey from perdition to salvation. And so, while it's very particularly the story of Dante, who was a very particular individual who lived at a very particular point in history, Dante's story is not just Dante's story. At the literal level, it is the story of Dante, but at the figurative level, the allegorical level, it's the story of all of us. And it's also allegory, is in effect an extended parable. It's a very Christian idea, and it has a didactic thrust, which is to say, an allegory always has a kind of a moral lesson encoded in it. And so I think we have to ask ourselves as we're reading this narrative if this I that speaks is also an allegorical I, that it is Friedman's own particular experience. But Friedman also casts himself, as we're going to see, as an allegory of the American experience in general in the Middle East. And I would go further than that and say there is a didactic dimension to this narrative as well. We've already said, Friedman wants to push very hard to show us that this is essentially a tribal conflict, but he'll go even further than that and propose a particular kind of solution, what he'll call a tribal solution to an essentially tribal conflict. So this is, whatever your views are of his politics, let's just be clear that this novel does have a rhetoric, or this nonfictional narrative has a very rhetorical dimension to it. There's certainly a lesson to be learned. Okay, so he's going to say, for instance, when he speaks of the Marines who came to Beirut and suffered this terrible after this suicide bombing in Beirut, he says, so it was with the U.S. Marines in Beirut, good milk-faced boys who stepped into the middle of a passion-filled conflict of whose history they were totally ignorant and whose venom they could not even imagine. So the Marines got an education they never bargained for, and like everyone else who went to Beirut, they got it the hard way. So the experience of Friedman, though, is very akin to the experience of these Marines in Beirut. They were all good milk-faced boys. They came into it, filled with utopian idealism and good optimistic hopes, and they left completely changed after their experience in Beirut. And this is going to be Friedman's experience, but it's also the experience of the Marines who came to Beirut. And indeed, he's going to suggest this is a quintessential American experience, or an American way of encountering this region. Now, it was in October 23rd in 1983 that this Beirut suicide car bombing occurred, in which 241 American service members were killed. Now, I can myself, I was a young man at that time, and I remember this very clearly. This was a shocking event that occurred, but nowadays we've seen so many shocking events of this nature that we've become almost callous to them. But at the time, it really was a very profoundly shocking event for Americans who had no idea, no point of reference for anything like this, except perhaps the hostage taking situation that had developed in Iran. But even then, there wasn't the carnage that one saw when this event took place. So this was I think the Friedman does have a point in the sense that this was the end of American innocence in some sense, if there was such a thing to begin with. All right. Well, a question then I think that we're compelled to ask ourselves as we examine this text is, what difference does it make that Friedman is a Jewish American man? And And in this regard, I would suggest to you, if we're looking at this in terms of extrinsic matters as opposed to intrinsic matters, the fact that Friedman is a Jewish American man is perhaps not all that significant if we're thinking extrinsically, but if we're thinking intrinsically, or in the way in which he himself articulates that identity in the pages of this narrative himself, or the way he constructs his own identity in the narrative, then it becomes quite significant a question that we need to ask, because it becomes an intrinsic textual question. And so a few questions to consider is, what has Friedman himself had to say about his Jewish identity while he lived in Beirut and then later in Jerusalem? And to what extent does his Jewishness affect his ability to be objective as a writer? Now, he's there as a reporter. Is he an objective reporter? Or is his objectivity compromised by his identity? What does he himself say about this? Now, he claims he doesn't want his Jewish American identity to get in the way of his reporting, but does it? Does he hide his Jewishness, or is he forthright about it? Well, let's see what he says himself. He says, "My policy was never to hide my religion from any friend or official who asked me about it straight out. But I did not go around introducing myself to strangers by saying, 'Hi, I'm Tom Friedman and I'm Jewish.' I think that's understandable. He probably doesn't do that in the U.S. either. I just didn't want my religion to be an issue that would get in the way of my reporting. I wanted people to judge me on what I wrote and not on who I was. But there was never a moment in Beirut when I wasn't keenly aware of who I was. For the first few weeks after we arrived, I always felt as though there was a glowing neon sign over my head that was constantly flashing, 'Jew, Jew, this man is a Jew.'" All right. Well, we're gonna take Friedman at his word here, and try to judge him not on sort of who he is, but on what he wrote. That's really the goal of our analysis here. But he does, make clear that it's very hard for him to not be self-conscious about the fact of his Jewish identity while he's living in Beirut. He says, "I never had any illusions that religion was not a basic element in the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. It couldn't help but be. This conflict involved not just two nations clashing over the same land, it also involved the clash of two religious communities, Muslims and Jews, with a long history of theological antagonisms between them. Yet, as much as I tried to play the objective reporter and stay above the fray, something would always come along and kick me in the gut to remind me how visceral and tribal this conflict really was, and that I was a member of one of the tribes." All right, this is a really revealing passage. He says, I seek to be objective, I seek to stay above the fray, in effect, but I'm convinced, because my experiences there convinced me that this is a tribal conflict, and I was one of those tribal members. Now, this again reinforces this notion that we started out this lecture examining when we looked at the quote from Mark Twain, that this is not a matter of settler colonialism. This is an ancient tribal conflict between two ancient tribes, and even though he's an American and not an Israeli, he himself is one of these tribal members. He is on the side of the Jewish tribe, whether he wants to be or not. And this, for him, he articulates this in very frank ontological terms, metaphysical terms, even that he was one of the people. He did belong, to one of the peoples. Or if we look back to this other quote from the previously looked at, he says, let's re-examine this. "I wanted people to judge me on what I wrote and not on who I was, but there was never a moment in Beirut when I wasn't keenly aware of who I was." Now, that is an ontological claim. That is a claim of himself as a particular being, to put it in ontological terms. And he admits that for him it was impossible to overcome his, let's say, his essential ontological identity as a Jewish man living in Beirut and then in Jerusalem. Now, Friedman's going to quote Fouad Ajame. He was an interesting figure, a Lebanese writer who wrote a book. He lived from 1945 to 2014, and he was very influential when he was alive. If you were to read just one text from him, I would recommend The Dream Palace of the Arabs, which was published in 1998, where he examines the Pan Arab movement from its inception to its decline. But he becomes, for Friedman, an important authority who Friedman's going to quote on more than one occasion in this text. And so here's a passage where Friedman affirmatively quotes Fouad Ajami, who says, in the 1970s, men in this region, the Levant, were introduced to something new, to modernization on a very rapid scale, to large wealth and large machines, to an Americanization and Westernization, to huge hotel chains and huge ideas, and most of all, to a less tribal world. But many people didn't like this world. And so at the end of the 1980s, the tribe returned with a vengeance. And the region and its conflicts were rendered true to their original dimensions. And then here's Friedman's gloss on this. He says, faced with the choice between passion and modernity, they, the Arabs, had chosen passion. Faced with the choice between expanding economies and tribes, they had chosen the tribe. The war had come down to eye level. Israeli eyes against Palestinian eyes, Maronite eyes, against Shiite eyes. And he speaks of how people walking the streets will try to break each other's eyes. So it becomes a very personal, the way that Friedman's describing this, a very personal tribal conflict, tribe against tribe. And he's right in the thick of it as a member of one of the tribes. But again, this reinforces this thesis that runs throughout this narrative. This is not a matter of settler colonialism for Friedman. It is an ancient tribal conflict come to life again as a reaction against modernism, which many people are not comfortable with. He's arguing here in the context of the 70s and 80s. Now here's a quote that reinforces this idea from Zev Shavitz that Israel too is a kind of a tribe. Israeli identity is a matter of tribal identity. He says what really holds Israel together at bottom is not democracy. It's not Zionism. It's not any ideology or any system. It is that tribal Jewish sense of solidarity. Israel is how the Jews behave when they are off the plantation, where there are no Gentiles around watching them. All the things here that the Americans complain about, I liked. I liked the bad manners. I liked the directness. I liked the excitement. I liked the adrenaline. I felt comfortable with these people. I belong here. And so here again is yet another reaffirmation of this notion that Jewish identity is primarily a tribal identity, and it's a tribal identity that Friedman himself sees himself affirming and belonging to, no matter how objective he seeks to be about the events that he's describing as a New York Times reporter. And he's going to be very explicit once he gets, after his long stint in Beirut and Jerusalem, he's going to be very frank. He's going to say what's needed in Palestine-Israel is a tribal solution for a tribal war. It is a solution that assumes the worst of both sides. This is because I believe that Israel not only holds all the cards, but has the power and the incentive to shape its own future without waiting for international conferences or outside mediators, or even for a Palestinian partner. We, and I emphasize we, live in a wilderness of tigers. We are in a struggle for our survival. The Palestinians and the Arabs have never wanted us here and never will want us here. So this is really interesting because there are these moments in the text when Friedman shifts very frankly from I to we. But in this case, the we is quite clearly not a more generic American we, but the we in question is a Jewish we. He's speaking here as a member of a particular tribe. It's a collective social identity, and it almost seems to be unconscious. This shifting back and forth that goes on in this text between Friedman speaking as an individual and then speaking as a member of a collective identity, or speaking in the form of the we, in the we form, using that pronoun rather than the I. And he's going to say, he makes no bones about it, and to that I don't agree with many of the things that he says, but I do appreciate his frankness. He's going to say, I consider my solution to the Palestinian-Israeli conflict quite Machiavellian. And so once he concludes that it's a tribal conflict, he's going to say it demands a tribal solution and it demands a Machiavellian solution. All right, now that means a solution along the lines of power politics. It becomes then, in the end, for Friedman, not really a matter of ethics and justice, but a matter of power politics. Who has the power and who doesn't have the power? Now, there's an image of Hobbes, who also was a Machiavellian thinker, and Machiavelli, there in the center, who was the author of The Prince, who is, in some views of some, except for perhaps Thucydides, the father of political realism, that politics are, in the last instance, about power rather than justice. And one must set ethics aside when one is dealing with primordial questions of existential survival. So we can think of Friedman then as a neo-realist when he speaks of what these of his own tribalism and what he describes and evokes as these power realities, that he constantly describes the Palestinians as being oblivious to these power realities that confront them. He's going to say the one thing that the Arab nations, this is not Palestine, but the other Arab nations and their leaders, like, let's say, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Syria, and so on, never did was to take Yasser Arafat, the leader of the PLO, the Palestinians, or Fatah, aside and tell him, look, my friend, the power realities are stacked against you. Your people got in the way of a bad storm called the Zionist movement. It could have happened to any of us, but it happened to you. If you really want to help your people, cut the best deal you can now with the Jews. Save whatever land you can and forget the rest. Instead, Friedman says, as Fuad Ajami put it, the Arabs walked away from the Palestinian cause while swearing eternal fidelity to the Palestinians. And so the way that Friedman's going to depict this conflict is that while Israelis like, let's say, Ariel Sharon were completely aware of the power realities inherent in this conflict, the Palestinians like Yasser Arafat were oblivious to them and falsely imagined that the Arab world was on their side, when in fact the Arab world had no intention of intervening on behalf of the Palestinians. It just wanted to adopt the rhetoric of Palestinian solidarity. Friedman says the Palestinians did not appreciate the power realities. The Zionists were much stronger than they appeared. Or here's another quote: Palestinians can demand or claim all they want, but the fact is only the Israelis are in a position to unilaterally initiate a settlement. And then he'll say further, it is always easier to give significance to suffering than to compel people to face a reality that offers only two choices, bad and worse. Either a tiny Palestinian state and part of the West Bank and Gaza, possibly independent, possibly federated with Jordan, or nothing at all. And so he makes no bones about it. He's on this one side of this conflict, and the solution is a tribal solution, he tells us, and the only way that it's going to be resolved is that the Palestinians have to wake up to the fact that the power realities are stacked against them. And Friedman does not apologize for his realism here, his political views. So this will bring an end to the first part of this lecture. There's a second lecture that follows, and we'll go a little bit more deeply into Friedman's views by focusing in the second lecture on Friedman's discussion of Zionism and the Zionist movement's relation to American Jews and to the colonization of the West Bank.